what single piece of evidence convinces you that Oswald alone killed Kennedy? The CIA kept Nosenko in a safe house where essentially for a few years they gave him the equivalent of early 9/11 detainee treatment. He shoots the president in the head at that moment. Nobody else in the car notices that. The governor, the governor's wife, Mrs. Kennedy, the Secret Service agent sitting next to him. No one hears the sound or sees the shot except for these people who are looking at it on film 10 years later. Jack, the biggest assignment of your life, you have to kill this fellow who's been arrested for killing the president because otherwise everything else will unravel. The Lee Harvey Oswald that I came to understand could have been in the 6th floor of a building in downtown Moscow shooting at Nikita Khrushchev on that day. I've done books on Nazi war criminals, as you know, on the heroin trade, on 9/11, on Saudi Arabia, on secrets inside the Vatican, on the pharmaceutical industry. I've never, ever had to have a police file opened up because of threats against me that I considered serious, except after Case Closed was published.
With the rise of the profile of RFK Jr., discussions of the assassination of John F. Kennedy are back. I obviously knew general things about the assassination, but was not very familiar with the details. It all changed, however, when my former guest, Michael Shermer, recommended picking up a book, Case Closed, by a best-selling author, Gerald Posner. All I can say is that I am now finishing a 3rd book by Posner, and 2 more are already downloaded into my Kindle, including his latest book, Pharma. That's how much impression Case Closed had on me, and in this interview you will find out why. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe. And now we start. I didn't know a lot about JFK assassination. I knew that, President was assassinated. I've heard that CIA or Mafia, somebody was involved in that because there is no way this poor soul by himself would pull it off. Then he was framed, etc., etc. Then I started reading your book, and it completely changed my mind. And the way it changed my mind wasn't the timeline, wasn't the ballistic expertise. It was just biography of Lee Harvey Oswald. When you were writing this book, did you plan to use his bio as the main tool of proving it?
No, absolutely not. The fascinating part of it is when I wrote the book, what I had proposed to my publisher, Random House, was not the book that you read. I didn't have the craziness to think it was possible to solve the case. So I proposed to them a book that would look at the entire assassination, look at it as an investigative reporter. It couldn't be the KGB if it was also the Cubans. It couldn't be the CIA if it was also the Mafia. There had to be a lot that was out in the public realm that was wrong. So I would go through all of the evidence with a fine-tooth comb and come down to the last 3 or 4 issues that you couldn't resolve. And then the publisher could put it out as a primer. Say, read this book before you read anything else on the assassination because you'll know what the real issues are. It was about halfway through my research, a year and a half into it, when Oswald's biography, his backstory, his tale started to predominate for me in the way that I looked at the case, because he was mentioned so few times in other books and conspiracies. He's, sort of a cipher. He's this character that we view as a patsy, incapable of pulling off the assassination. And what you said a moment ago, Azan, are so interesting, because when somebody says to me who doesn't know the case very well, they'll say, what single piece of evidence convinces you that Oswald alone killed Kennedy? I don't have a very good answer for them, but I say it's actually Oswald. Because to understand Oswald is to understand not only why he may have ended up in the window shooting at the president in 1963, but also why he was so unreliable that no intelligence service would actually use him as a real agent. So Oswald sort of opens up the window to understanding why Kennedy died.
Let's talk about his background a little bit. Describe him.
I mean, one of the things that I think that many of your listeners may not know is that when he shoots at the president, he's just turned 24 years old the month before. He's younger than many people think. They look at Oswald. He seems a more mature person in these clips and that. They think of him as a 30-something person. And we forget often that the people who strap suicide bombs on or take shots at political leaders or want to change history through the barrel of a gun are often in their 20s. They have that type of belief that they're going to change everything. Very seldom do you get a 50 or 55 or 60-year-old suicide bomber or assassin. So Oswald is imbued with this idea of politics. He has, he's, for lack of a better term, we call him a leftist. Yes, he had defected to the Soviet Union in the height of the Cold War, which is unusual. But he came from a very, very bad sort of childhood background, a mother that was, barely keeping control of him. And we have something unusual with Oswald. At 13 years of age, he is committed for a moment to a psychiatric examination. So never do we usually get a psychiatric exam on somebody later accused of killing a famous figure. Here we have a young teenager who has a psychiatric exam. And the reason he was sent there was, believe it or not, truancy from school, which seems like such. Today, people are running out with $100,000 in goods from a local department store and they aren't arrested. But then if you didn't attend school, you could be sent as a truant to school for a psychiatric exam. And the psychiatrist who interviewed him, who did the analysis, when he was later questioned by the Warren Commission a decade later, remembered him because he said he arrived here for such a minor charge, not going to school. And I remembered him because his diagnosis was so serious, this schizoid sort of disturbed personality disorder that had an explosive ability for acting out, a disturbed youngster. And he recommended that the mother commit him to an institution until he was better. And what she did is she just took him out of the state and returned to another state. He joins the Marine Corps as a teenager because he thinks that his brother joined. It's going to change his life. And it's a disaster for him. They think he's gay. They call him Mrs. Oswald. They shove him in the shower. He hates it. So he defects to the Soviet Union at a certain point, thinking, okay, I'm going to be welcomed as a great heroic character, an ex-Marine who now embraces communism. And the Soviets give him a psychoanalysis, and they look at him and they talk to him and they say, no, go home. And he's so distraught he tries to kill himself. They find him before he's dead and they put him out of the provincial capital of Minsk. And by the time he decides he hates the Soviet Union and comes back to the U.S., it takes him a year and a half. He's married a young Russian bride. He gets back here and he is disenchanted. But the key, as you know, is that he does commit himself early to political assassination, not of Jack Kennedy, not of the president, but of a retired right-wing army general who's running for the governorship of Texas. He misses him, much to his disdain. And Oswald is somebody who is, a sort of this lost character, but an explosive lost character in all of 1962 and 63 leading up to the assassination.
And it's interesting, I didn't know that he lived in the USSR, even though I was born there. What was the highlight of his life in USSR? It's outside the fact that if he actually committed suicide, if he died, well, Kennedy would be alive probably.
Yes, I mean, there's no question. I mean, one of the interesting things is there's so many. The frustrating thing about Kennedy's assassination is there's so many ifs. What if? What if? What if Oswald had, in fact, instead of missing the general, Edwin Walker, had hit him or killed him? The investigation would have been a real one and might have found who it was who had done it. A month and a half before Oswald shoots at the president, he decides he's given up on America. He doesn't like the Soviet Union because they have bastardized communism. So he's going to the place where the real revolution is, to Cuba. But he has to go first to Mexico City and applies at the Cuban and Soviet missions to get a visa to go to Havana. And they reject him. What if the Cubans and the Soviets had said yes? And he was in Havana on November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy would have been fine. Even the day of the assassination, Oswald is not committed to a suicide mission. He wants to live and survive. And so when he takes his rifle in that morning, hidden in a long brown paper bag, and tells the person who's driving in that there are curtain rods that he doesn't have any need for, actually, in the rooming house he lives in. When he goes into that building, he's up on the 6th floor of this book depository where he works. His fellow workers, 5 of them, leave at 12 o'clock. The president's motorcade is not coming back at 12:30. What if they didn't leave? What if they said, we're going to watch the motorcade from here? He wasn't going to pull out the gun and start to shoot at them and then at the president. What if the bubble top had been put on the limousine? It wasn't bulletproof, but it might have provided a glare from the sun that would have blinded the shooter, and he would have been unable to do it. What even if the driver of the limousine, the oldest member of the security detail, had hit the gas and done evasive maneuvers after the first two shots? The headshot, the final one, the one that was fatal, might not have happened. So I look at this in so many ways and say, what if? There's so many ways the president could have been alive, but in the end, it all broke right in the perfect storm for the assassin.
And it's also interesting that he didn't hate Kennedy, and it was complete almost coincidence that he ended up killing him in the first place. He wasn't his target his entire life. Can you walk us through how that happened?
It's so fascinating to me, having spent a lot of time on this, because people have trouble appreciating what I call an equivocal assassin. How could you possibly, be equivocating about whether you want to kill somebody, especially as important as the president of the United States? You would think this is a committed passion that you've had for a long time, a hatred, a personal reason why you need to get there. And in Oswald's case, the Lee Harvey Oswald that I came to understand could have been in the 6th floor of a building in downtown Moscow shooting at Nikita Khrushchev on that day. He was ready to throw a cog into the machinery of government. He hated the United States, capitalism and what it stood for, but he hated the Soviet Union for what he viewed as how it had ruined communism, pure communism. And he was ready to strike that. But it was really an act of opportunity, because he didn't know until the 19th or 20th, depending on the day he looked at the newspaper, that the president's motorcade would go in front of the building that he had a job at, and that he would have that chance. And the night before the assassination, he has to go outside of Dallas to a suburb where his wife, Marina, is living with a friend. They're separated. He has to retrieve the rifle. It's going to be used in the assassination the next day. But he has this heartfelt discussion that leads into an argument with Marina. He says to her, "Come back. Let's get back together." They don't have much money. They have only a few $100s. He says, "I'll buy you a washing machine. I'll make it work," because they had had a very tumultuous marriage. He'd beaten her at times. She was separated from him. He said, "Come back and join me." And she says later, "I was very, very stubborn, and I just kept rejecting him all the time. I said, no, no, no." Later that night, while they were asleep in bed, she said at one point her foot crossed over and rested on his leg, and he pushed it away with a ferocity that surprised her. The next morning, when she got up, she didn't notice it right away. He had already left for work. He had left his wedding ring on the cabinet next to their bed, the first time he'd ever taken it off, and he had left almost $200, almost all their life savings. She knew something was wrong. But the question you have to ask is, what if she had said yes the night before? What if she had said, "Yes, Lee, okay, let's do it again"? Was he asking her just as a fake question? Did he not mean it? Or would that have possibly put off the assassination of the president of the United States? How is it possible that somebody could be committed to killing the president, but not so committed that they couldn't be dissuaded at the last moment? That's the puzzle. That's the great mystery that you have to unravel to understand Oswald.
And I believe what's also interesting that the person who she lived with is the one who found a job for him at that place in a repository. So all these conspiracies that he was somehow placed in there, it's almost impossible to pull.
So, the great thing is, to me, once you get into the facts, you understand how it took place. And you're absolutely right. The placement of Oswald at the job that he shoots at, people say, well, that's too coincidental. There must be something about that. The CIA must have arranged a job for him at the book depository. And in fact, you find out, as you said, the woman, Ruth Payne, who's letting Marina live at her house, they're looking for a job for Lee when he comes back from Mexico City because he has no work. And a friend of Ruth Payne says, "Oh, my brother just got a job at a place called the Texas School Book Depository." So Ruth calls up that place and talks to the supervisor. He has two positions available. One is at a suburban warehouse where they process books, and one is at the downtown location. And he says, "Send him down here and I'll see what he's like." He gets the job at the downtown location. The actual route for the motorcade hasn't been set at that point. So it's not like they know the president is going by there and they're going to put him in. One last thing, on this. When Oswald was taking the bus to Mexico City to try to get to Cuba, it was September 25th, overnight into September 26th. Most people don't realize that that was the day that the White House announced for the first time that President Kennedy was going to visit Dallas or visit Texas. They didn't even say the cities yet on this political trip in November. That means that If there was a conspiracy to kill the president, Oswald was on his way to Mexico City. If he had been allowed to go to Havana from the Soviets and the Cubans, he wouldn't have been in Dallas on the day the president was there. When he comes back into Texas, rejected from his ability to get to Mexico, to Havana, that's the beginning of October. So the next 6 weeks, from the beginning of October to the death of the president, is when a conspiracy has to bring Oswald into it, because they couldn't know before he went to Mexico City that the president was even going to be there. You can't do it by telepathy. You can't do it by text message. You can't send him you have to have somebody make the contact. And that's where the conspiracies fall apart completely. There's no telephone call. They've checked the records from the book depository. They checked the records from the rooming house he lived in, Marina's records. Where is the person that's supposed to show up on his doorstep and say, by the way, Lee, here's your assignment? It just doesn't happen. And so there's a great fancy to believe that this was a long-term plot, but in the key period in which it would have had to have taken place and been mobilized to bring Oswald into it, there's only silence.
We touched on conspiracies, but you obviously studied many of them, and you debunk most of them in this book. What was the actually most convincing or possible conspiracy? It's question number one. And question number two, what's the dumbest conspiracy you've heard that just doesn't make any sense?
I'll start with the easier one first, the dumbest conspiracy. And boy, I'll tell you, that has some real competition. The Jim Garrison, who was the hero in Oliver Stone's film, the DA from New Orleans, he believed for a while that somebody had shot at the president from this manhole cover in the sewer as the motorcade rode by, until he went to Dallas and saw that he would have had to be about 4 feet 6 inches tall to fit into that area to make the shot. But that was one of the dumbest. I think the dumbest for me is when people believe, and some do, that the driver of the limousine is the one who killed the president with the headshot. That he turns around on the Zapruder film, the home movie of the assassination. The driver is looking, he's a Secret Service agent, back at the president, and then he turns back to move out of Dealey Plaza after the headshot. People believe that there's a sort of a glint of light near his hand as he turns around, and that must be a small revolver or a Derringer. He shoots the president in the head at that moment. Nobody else in the car notices that. The governor, the governor's wife, Mrs. Kennedy, the Secret Service agent sitting next to him, no one hears the sound or sees the shot except for these people who are looking at it on film 10 years later. And they adamantly believe that that was the secret shot. So that's the dumbest, I believe. As for Oswald, I always say there are two parts to figuring this case out. One is determining who shot and killed Kennedy. And I'm absolutely convinced that the only shooter that day who hit anyone in Dealey Plaza was shooting from behind the president in the area where Oswald was last seen on the 6th floor of the depository. I believe that the bullets that tied ballistically to his gun and the evidence around that gun with his fingerprints and where he was means that he was the shooter. The tougher question on any assassination is figuring out whether he did it for himself or was he motivated by some group that wanted him to do it. And understanding Oswald is why you know that almost no group could rely on him because he was incredibly unreliable. Mm-hmm. But more than that, the hardest part for me, the most difficult of the not necessarily conspiracy theories, but the idea of what motivated Oswald was he motivated by his desire to show the Cubans that they made a great mistake by rejecting him to go to Havana. He had been there at the Cuban mission and twice at the Soviet mission in Mexico City, arguing that he was a good communist and that he should be able to go to Havana. He was turned down. At the Soviet mission, we now know, because the KGB have released their files, that he took his pistol out at one point, slammed it on the table. They were sort of startled at that. There's a report that's never been confirmed for the Cubans that he threatened at one point, I'll do something to show you, I'll kill the president if need be. I don't know if that's true, but I do know this. There was a part of Oswald that day that was showing everybody in his past that had rejected him, turned him down, thought he was a loser in life, including even those Cubans who said you can't come to Havana because you're not a pure enough communist, that he was the greatest of them all. So it's not as though it's a conspiracy, but it's more about the motivation. It might have been an external motivation in part. I'm not saying that Castro asked Oswald to kill Kennedy, but he might have unwittingly been part of the motivation for it.
One of the controversial issues that you solve in the book is that magic bullet, because it's unbelievable to people that it can hit president and the governor. Can you elaborate how that happened?
The thing is, I realize now that the names that we give things matter. And so, for instance, we call something bail reform. That sounds like it's making it better, but maybe it's not if it's just letting people who are committing crimes off without cash bail. So, the word reform is very powerful. Magic bullet makes it sound automatically as though it's not a real bullet. It can't have happened because it needed magic. I understand that. So the single bullet has over a period of time been correctly, sort of in a derogatory way, and Oliver Stone reached the zenith of it in his film JFK. Fantastic film, but terrible history. The bullet sort of hesitates in midair, does a couple of somersaults, makes a left turn, right turn, and it goes on to hit Kennedy. So we all say that's impossible. And you have a bullet that, according to the Warren Commission, and they could not prove this. This is critical. They could only guess that this is how it happened. They thought that a single shot from the shooter behind, let's say it's not Oswald for a moment, whoever it is, the assassin fires a bullet. That bullet, which is the second shot, hits Kennedy in the high right sort of area, low neck, high shoulder area, passes through Kennedy without hitting any bone. Now, it's fired from this Mannlicher Carcano, an Italian military rifle. It's 160 grain, full metal jacketed bullet. It's fired at 2,000 feet a second, hits Kennedy in the back at about 1,500 to 1,600 feet based upon the distance from the shooter, comes through his neck, and it's tumbling at that point. And the reason that can be said without any doubt is that the entrance wound into Connally, the governor, who's sitting a little lower and in front of the president in the limousine, is 1.25 inches long. That's the length of the bullet. So it's tumbling sideways and enters into Connally's right shoulder area. Connally is sort of turned a little bit to the rear because he's turning around to look at the president to make sure he's all right after the first bullet was fired 3.5 seconds earlier. And it passes through, hitting Connally's rib at one point, which flattens the bullet out a little bit on the side, comes out under his nipple, goes into his wrist, which is holding his Stetson hat, and the bullet hits the wrist at about 900 feet a second, enough to shatter the bone, not enough to destroy the bullet, and then it goes through the wrist and goes into his thigh at about 400 feet a second, enough to penetrate but not deeply. It pops out when he's being treated at Parkland Hospital, the Dallas hospital, which they're all taken, and it's later found that afternoon by the FBI and the police. Now, you say to me, if you hear all of that, that sounds like a great theory, Gerald, but how do we know that works? So it's not me just coming up with that. That's actually from ballistics tests that were done in 1992 and 1993 that changed the thinking on the Kennedy assassination. Finally, ballistics experts doing a recreation for a courtroom team called Failure Analysis figured out how the single bullet, the so-called magic bullet, happened. What the Warren Commission, the FBI, couldn't figure out in 1964 when they were doing their own investigation was that the bullet slowed as it hit these body parts. So you had to have it hit the wrist on Connally, the rib, at the speed at which it was slowed up to as it was going through them. They recreated this with 2 cadavers. They're the size and weight of the president and the governor. They fired shots through them, and I reproduce one of them in the book. All day long, you can now reproduce the equivalent of the so-called magic bullet in very, very good condition, the same as what happened in the assassination. That being said, people believe that if I conclude the magic bullet is real, that it happened, I'm therefore saying Oswald killed Kennedy. Not at all. All I'm saying is that one shot fired from behind the president hit the president and the governor that day, and is the bullet identified as 399, that exhibit. That is the single bullet. But it doesn't tell you who the assassin is. It doesn't tell you if there were other shooters at Dealey Plaza. It doesn't tell you if there was a conspiracy afoot. People put so much effort into the single bullet. If the single bullet didn't exist, there'd be a conspiracy at the scene because you'd have to have a 4th shot. And Oswald only has time for 3. But with that bullet, you still haven't concluded what happened in the rest of the case, if that makes sense.
And you said that that ballistic studies happened in 1992, 1993. The book came out in 1993. Were you waiting for that to be completely coincidental?
I wish I could say I was smart enough to wait for the results of that ballistic test. The ballistic test actually came out in 92. The book came out in 93. At the time, we were publishing to an anniversary, the 30th anniversary. So that was the real thing. And that meant in the book world, for people, your listeners who aren't aware of this, they probably think that a book is finished, wrapped up at the publisher, and then published the next month. No, the book is actually wrapped up like 4 or 5 months before publication, because the publisher needs to send out what they call uncorrected galleys to all the major review organizations, the New York Times, the London Book Review, the Washington Post. They get early copies. They then assign a reviewer to review that. The review is written up. It's ready to go when the book is published. The publisher also tries to sell foreign rights beforehand. They try to sell serial rights to magazines. So we published in August of 1993, a few months before the 30th anniversary. The book was probably finished and wrapped up by April or March. I'd have to look back at the very latest. And from that moment on, you're pretty much just hoping that nothing changes what you've already written.
The other character that's been also controversial is Jack Ruby. People also were saying like, oh, he's the one who was supposed to kill the killer of the president. And you use the same approach. You basically tell us his story, and it's obvious that the guy with such a big mouth cannot be part of conspiracy.
It was so fascinating because Jack Ruby, again, if somebody says to me, why did Ruby kill Oswald? It's very hard to put into a soundbite, right? Because if you don't understand Ruby and what took place, people say, okay, you've convinced me maybe that one lone sociopath killed the president, but don't tell me there was another one in Dallas that weekend. They happened to cross paths on Sunday after the Friday assassination, because it stretches credulity. And one of the reasons I think that people immediately, and there'll be always a large segment of people who think it's a conspiracy because of the murder of Oswald by Ruby. And when I looked at that, we all go into these subjects that we know something about, but not a great deal, with a bit of a bias. You have to. None of us are clean slates on areas of history. So my bias going in when I started the book was that likely the mob was somehow involved because of Ruby's murder of Oswald. It looked to me as though it was a mob silencing. Ruby looks like a character out of central casting from Hollywood, looking like he wants to be a mobster. So how could it not be that? Then, when you get into Jack Ruby, you realize it's anything but. It is this guy who likes to be in the center of action. The police in Dallas should hang their head in shame, because the Dallas police headquarters was not a very secure place over the weekend with the accused assassin of the president there. Fellows like Jack Ruby, who own a strip club, an adult strip club in Dallas called the Carousel Club, are allowed to roam freely inside the Dallas police jail. He's handing out business cards to Agency Francaise, to the Stern magazine and Spiegel, and to the London Observer and others, saying, by the way, when this is all over, before you leave Dallas, stop down at my strip club. I'll buy you some drinks. That's Jack Ruby. He wants to be where the action is. The action that weekend was at the Dallas police headquarters. He was there. He was part of it. And you can see how over the course of the weekend, he's worked up a little bit. He becomes, through his sister and others who talk to him, angrier about what happened. He has this unusual view that that some of it was this anti-Jewish effort. There had been an ad run just when the president arrived in Dallas, signed with a Jewish surname, and Ruby was sure that was to embarrass people. And he had this convoluted view of what was happening in the world. And the best reason for me as to why this isn't a planned silencing is that in a effort in which Oswald only has to be killed, it seems to me, in a conspiracy, if he knows something. Let's say he's not the shooter. He knows something, you have to kill him. He's either brought the rifle in, he knows who somebody is. You've pulled off the perfect crime in Dallas, but you've left Oswald alive. Now, you would think that a conspiracy would kill Oswald at the book depository when he was on his way out. Maybe they put an assassin there to kill Oswald behind the book depository, but how did Oswald leave? He walked out the front of the building, right down the front steps. So he wasn't trying to evade anyone. He didn't run out the side and hide or anything else, but they let him live by mistake, let's assume. So now they have to call Jack Ruby, who's a very tenuous character on his own, not the most reliable, but let's say they have no other choice. And they say, Jack, the biggest assignment of your life, you have to kill this fellow who's been arrested for killing the president, because otherwise everything else will unravel. And Ruby goes to the jail on Friday night. Oswald walks in front of him. Ruby has his pistol. You can see it on his jacket in one of the still pictures. And what does he do? Nothing. He doesn't even make a move for him. It's as though he's received this assignment and he says, you know what? I think I will kill him at my own convenience. And Saturday, he goes to the jail again. and Oswald's there and walks outside at one point, and Ruby does nothing. And on Sunday, he would have missed Oswald if it hadn't been for one of his strippers asking for a MoneyGram to be sent. He took his time to go downtown to send it from the only Western Union station that was open in Dallas. And Oswald's removal from the station to another custody was delayed for an hour. And Ruby walks down the stairs of the jail at the moment Oswald is taken out and impetuously kills him. I tell you, it is the perfect storm again, if in terms of coincidence, but not conspiracy.
And Oswald himself, I believe, got delayed with his departure because of he wanted to dress differently.
So there was a postal inspector, Harry Holmes, who showed up, who wanted to talk to Oswald about using the mail to order the gun, which seems very unimportant in light of the assassination of the president, but that delayed it for 45 minutes. Then Oswald decided to change his sweater, so he's delayed another 15 minutes. If Oswald had not changed the sweater and asked for that, he would have left by the time Ruby had finished sending the MoneyGram. Now, let me tell you how it works, though, from a conspiracy viewpoint, because I talk to people who think it's a conspiracy. And when I point that out, they say the following. That was all kabuki theater. They would have kept Oswald locked up inside the jail until Ruby was there. So if Ruby had been another hour, they would have found another reason to delay him. They would have said, oh, Lee, you have to have a dental exam. Oh, Lee, you have to call your mother or something. But that, of course, is not supported by any evidence, but that's how the conspiracy mind would consider it, which is Ruby was on a mission. We're going to make it look as though it was just spontaneous. So we need to keep Oswald until that happens. But of course, the Oswald asking for his own change of clothing is pretty tough to say that he was part of the own effort to delay his departure until he ran into Ruby.
Do you ever debate this conspiracist, or you just roll your eyes and move on?
No, I do try, and I have tried to debate. I had a debate at Books and Books, which is a bookstore in Coral Gables, with Roger Stone, who had been, one of President Trump's advisors. Stone believes that JFK was killed by Lyndon Johnson. And the debate is almost impossible for the following reason. You can't agree on the evidence. So, for instance, my view as a lawyer and an investigative reporter, I'm going to go with the best evidence. And what I mean by that is, let's say we had a massive car wreck. Right now, the two of us, we were on the street corner, a wreck took place, somebody died, 2 cars, and there were 10 witnesses. I guarantee you, I know that when you talk to those witnesses, they're going to describe it a little differently. One might even see the car color differently. They would see the number of people. That's how eyewitness testimony is. So if I say, okay, I'm going to determine how many shots there were at Dealey Plaza by the ear witnesses, and I look at all the accounts and I say, gee, most of them thought it was 3 shots. That may be persuasive, but the Zapruder film is going to be the absolute better evidence by showing me when the shots take place and when they hit the people. And then if you want the ultimate evidence, it's going to be the x-rays and the autopsy photos, because they're going to show you without any question where the bullets were on the bodies. But there are people who won't agree that the x-rays from the autopsy and the photos are authentic. They say, oh, of course it shows shots from behind because they've been tampered with. Now, they've been tested for evidence of fakery by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who concluded there was no evidence of fakery at all and they were authentic, but they still don't believe that. There are people, when I cite the Zapruder film to show the sequence of shots that hit the president and wounded him and then killed him, they say the Zapruder film has been tampered with. They don't offer any evidence of that, but that is almost impossible to counter. There are people who say the Oswald in Mexico City was an imposter. It's been set up by the CIA. So yes, I try to debate people on it, but it's very difficult because it's almost as though I'm dealing with an alternative universe.
Who is Yuri Nosenko?
Yuri Nosenko is a fantastic character and story on his own, a ranking KGB agent who defected to the United States after the assassination in the mid-'60s, and who James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence in the CIA, thought there was a mole in the CIA. And when Nosenko arrived, he concluded that Nosenko was a fake defector. To lead the CIA into a whole bunch of information was false. And to prove that, the CIA kept Nosenko in a safe house where essentially for a few years they gave him the equivalent of early 9/11 detainee treatment, not waterboarding, but everything else, in dark and in deprivation, treating him horribly, loses his teeth to get him to confess. And finally, after 2.5, 3 years of this, they conclude, oh, okay, he's a real defector. And they had other information to confirm it. Nosenko stays in the United States under a different fake identity, under sort of witness protection. And he tells a story about Oswald, which is fascinating because he had seen and been in charge of the Oswald file, in essence, in 1963 that showed him to be very unstable when he defected there. And he was the KGB agent who got the request from the mission, the embassy in Mexico City, when the KGB agents there said, hey, we've got this guy who speaks Russian, pretty good Russian. It says he was a defector to the Soviet Union. And is this true? And Nosenko essentially sent a message back that said, he's a nut, forget about him. And many people had asked to interview Nosenko over the years, but no one knew where he was. So they had to send a letter to the CIA, and he never got a response. I did the same thing. In 1991, I sent a letter to the CIA public information officer saying, please forward this to Yuri Nosenko. If he would like to talk, I'd be happy to. In 92, I got a letter back from the CIA that said, he is willing to talk to you. You'll have to pay for his flight to Washington. I said, fine. And then they said, after they came back a week later and they said, no, we don't want you to pay for his flight, because if you pay for his flight, you'll be able to figure out by the fare where he's living, because it'll narrow down by flight. So they brought him into Washington, or he came by his own means. I don't know. I had to go to CIA headquarters to meet with him. And we got along very well. We even went, the man who was living under a different identity, we went to dinner at a Turkish restaurant outside of CIA headquarters later with my wife, and she met him. I asked him, why did you agree to talk to me when you haven't spoken to everybody else for all this time? He said, you were the first request I had received after the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm no longer afraid for my life. I believe that the fall of the Soviet Union, and at that time, what he thought was the end of the KGB. We know that's not the case. KGB just it moved on to become different leadership, meant that he was safe. So he was waiting all that time for something like that to happen, to be able to talk. But now, if you are a conspiracy believer, let's say you think that the CIA killed Kennedy or was involved in this massive conspiracy, you say, so how is it that a guy like Gerald Posner, who's never done any work on the Kennedy assassination, comes up with this book for the 30th anniversary that says Oswald did it? All of the big newspapers, the New York Times, everybody else, they embrace it because the mainstream media, they have to follow the official story. It's a finalist for the Pulitzer because they are stamping the official story. And how is it that Posner gets to talk to Yuri Nosenko? The CIA provides him. When I give that explanation, which is exactly what happened, they can't believe it. But that's how journalism happens. I know this. I'd love to be able to say that we as journalists are always smart enough to know the exact correct time to apply for information, but you don't. And sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. I have been rejected now for 8 years, or coming on 9 years, from the Vatican archives to get financial documents I want. One day, maybe there will be a cardinal in charge of those archives, or a pope in Rome who will open the files up. It will be the right moment, but it hasn't happened yet. Another time in 1984, I arrived in Argentina to ask for a file on Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor, and it turned out that the military junta had been thrown out of power because they'd lost the Falklands War. And the new government, which was a civilian government, Raul Alfonsín, in a spasm of democracy, opened the file to me. But it wasn't because I was smart enough to go there when he was in power. It was the luck of the timing. And that was the same with Nosenko. That's the nature of journalism. It's
funny. I had that question to you because I was looking at the YouTube comments under the interviews, and it's like, Posner is related to CIA. And my question here is like, if you were writing a book about yourself, just like you wrote about Oswald, like what part of your biography would you use to show like, hey, this doesn't make sense that he's a CIA agent?
Here's what's so fascinating. So to anybody who says, he must be a CIA agent because he concluded that Oswald alone did it, tells me immediately they do not understand the first thing about journalism, investigative journalism. As an investigative journalist, as an author, what you want, and I can say this I almost never say it without some like caveat, but this I say without hesitation. Every investigative reporter or author wants the biggest possible story resulting from their research. What would I have loved for Case Closed would have been to find the incontrovertible piece of evidence that established a conspiracy so that I could come back at that time, we're talking the 90s, to convince Peter Jennings of ABC News, Dan Rather of CBS News, and Tom Brokaw of NBC News, the three big anchors who had real power then, that this was in fact a conspiracy. I would have been Bob Woodward and Bernstein rolled up into one overnight, the two Washington Post reporters who broke Watergate. That would have been the story that would have been on fire. To return to my publisher and to say, by the way, I've gone through all this evidence and I've concluded that the Warren Commission made some big mistakes, but they got the basic conclusion right. It was really Oswald. Does not sound like a very sensational conclusion. We were afraid at Random House that nobody would be interested, but you have to follow the evidence to where it goes. So people say, this is the way he was predetermined. This is what he wanted to say from the beginning. It must have been part of a larger feeling. They just don't understand journalism. You want to establish just the opposite. But if you can't, if the evidence takes you somewhere where the conclusion is smaller, you have to go there. What I didn't realize, what did surprise me, two things. When the book was published, we thought at Random House, they said, the small number of people think it's Oswald alone won't read or buy the book because they'll say, I already know that. I don't need to read a 500-page book. People think it's a conspiracy will say, I'll never waste my money on that. I heard the Warren Commission say that years ago. We didn't realize that after 30 years, and almost still the case today, coming on 60 years later, that the most eye-opening conclusion is to say, I think Oswald did it alone. People think you've just landed from outer space on a spaceship or something. They say, you're kidding. You really believe that? And then you argue your case and you say why. The other thing was, I've done books on Nazi war criminals, as you know, on the heroin trade, on 9/11, on Saudi Arabia, on secrets inside the Vatican, on the pharmaceutical industry. I've never, ever had to have a police file opened up because of threats against me that I considered serious, except after Case Closed was published.
Interesting.
People picketed in Boston. They sent dead fish to me. They sent a rat's tail at one point. I was accosted on the street in New York City on an airplane with my wife and myself on the plane with a flight attendant that we thought was on the edge of almost getting violent. And I didn't understand that at first. I don't sanction any of it, but I understand it now in this sense. If you're someone who believes in your heart and soul that the CIA, let's say, and the secret government killed Kennedy, and Oliver Stone does a film which, even despite its errors, you embrace because it's opening up the case again, and there's talking about the assassination. And then this guy comes along who's never been involved in the assassination, puts out a book that says it's Oswald, and the mainstream press all says, great book, we think that's right. You must think to yourself, it's impossible that happened by coincidence. It must be part of the plot. And either I'm a complete idiot, and if they talk to me, they know I'm not an idiot, or I must be part of the plot, and therefore they just feel like smashing me in the face. That type of violence surprised me. That really, really did. Because of all the things, if you said to me, of all your 13 books, which one did you find yourself in the most precarious situation? It was in that immediate aftermath of the publication of Case Closed.
A lot of information was released fairly recently, right? If you were write a new version of the book, like release it, what would you add from that information?
You're the first one to know this. The first one it'll be public on. I am putting an afterword. I don't know if they'll call it an afterword into the digital edition of Case Closed for the 60th anniversary. It's about 3,000 words. Nice. It is a compressed look at the files over a period of time. And I don't want to, ruin the ending, but the ending is still case still closed. So that there is nothing that has come out in the last 30 years that has changed any fundamental aspect of how I look at the case. If I was writing Case Closed from scratch, I might be more critical of the CIA today because of their lack of cooperation with the Warren Commission, the extent to which they tried to hide information from Mexico City that they knew about Oswald. And also, I did a book called Why America Slept in 2003 about 9/11. And I learned something about the CIA then that could apply here back to Oswald. There was a moment before 9/11 in 2000, the end of 99, in which the CIA is following two Saudi suspected terrorists into a meeting, that's sort of a summit meeting for terrorism in Malaysia. They don't know their identity at that point, but they're tracking them because they picked up audio calls with them. The Malaysian authorities, at the behest of the CIA, then make a video of them. They have video surveillance of them. Those two people then come into the United States, Midari and Al-Mizadi. They settle into California. They take out driver's license and their real names. They aren't hiding. They're hiding in plain sight. CIA doesn't tell anyone about them. At one point, one of them goes to Saudi Arabia, needs to get a new visa. When they apply, they're not on the terror watch list, so there's no problem. When they go to make their reservations for the flights that they flew on that day on 9/11, they made them in their real name. If they'd been on a watch list with the FAA, 9/11 may not have happened. The CIA shared the information the month before the attacks because they were getting nervous because of the increasing chatter. My point is, in Mexico City, the CIA says we have no audio surveillance of Oswald at the Cuban mission or the Soviet mission. I don't know if I necessarily believe that. They had those missions penetrated with CIA assets. Did they know that Oswald smashed his pistol down at the table at the Soviet mission? Did they know he might have threatened the president or somebody else at the Cuban mission? When he came back into the United States in early October, I will tell you this, that no matter what they learned in Mexico City, they didn't tell anyone else. They kept it to themselves. And if they had reported it to the FBI, as they're required to, since they can't do domestic investigations, maybe the FBI, who had a file open on Oswald, would have realized that he had a job later at the building where the motorcade was running in front of. Now, I know there are a lot of ifs in that, but my point is that the CIA does what it always does. It gets information on somebody it's looking at, and then it keeps it to itself. It doesn't share it. They don't provide it to other organizations. We saw it on 9/11. And I think that on Kennedy, although the final files here may indicate that they knew a little bit more, that he was unstable, they didn't know he was going to kill the president. They certainly didn't tell anyone, and they didn't help avoid this catastrophe, this tragedy.
You wrote 13 books, as you said, and several became bestsellers. And all these books are in different subjects. Like, how do you select subjects for your book? And how has your publisher become comfortable with your not being specialized in a particular area?
I'm very, very lucky to, in a day and age in which people and publishers like people to be specific, to have one little niche in which they operate, as opposed to being general interest authors, that I'm able to go to my publisher just at the point where I get an expertise in a field, whether it's Nazi war criminal, whether it's the Kennedy assassination, the King assassination, or the Saudis. And then I say to them, thank you very much. We got good reviews on this. I really have all my contacts. I have the sources to go back to. I know where the information is, but I want to go on to something else I know nothing about. And then I give them another subject, and I start recreating the world from the ground up. That to me is the great fun, the challenge of doing this. And publishers are initially resistant. They want you to stay in the area in which you've just built up good reviews and a good expertise, go on to do something else about it. But to me, the challenge is figuring it out completely new. That's why it takes a while for my book sometimes to get done. In addition, the publisher doesn't always say yes. So what I mean is the 13 books you see are the 13 books to which a publisher has committed early on. I need that. I need to know the publisher will be there when I return with the manuscript. But when I propose this subject to them, I really don't know what the conclusions will be because I haven't yet done the research. I need to do the research in the next couple of years, and they have to have the faith in me I'm going to return with a good book. But sometimes they say no to the idea. So, for instance, I had proposed this Kennedy book about looking at all the issues and coming down to the 5 or 6 issues before Oliver Stone had done his film. And they said no to that. They said, no one will be interested. So I did a book instead called Hitler's Children, Interviews with Sons and Daughters of Nazi War Criminals. Stone then did JFK, which electrified the subject for the American public and internationally. And the publisher said, you know, that book, that little book you were going to do, maybe there's a market for it now. Pharma was Vatican was proposed originally in 2003, 2004. They didn't want that. I did a book instead on the Saudis. So it took another publisher to want the book on the Vatican. On the book on pharma was a book I had originally proposed in 99 or 2000. I got no's on that from publishers about 3 times. I finally brought it back up to Simon & Schuster in 2015, and they liked it. So, there's no magic to this, but it's a process of just staying persistent.
And Farmer covers a little bit of a Sackler family, right?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I didn't know boy, I tell you, this is the best example. I'm sorry to get excited about this, but the best example of how you don't know what you're going to write about in your proposal is I looked back at my proposal just recently for pharma, and I mentioned the Sacklers and Purdue and OxyContin in passing in a few sentences. In a 30-page proposal, they were just part of a story that would be told in one chapter. They became the narrative spine of the book, in part because when I made freedom of information requests to the government, the FBI released files to me from the 1950s and 1960s and 1940s as well that showed they'd been investigating the senior Sacklers for 20 years because they had been card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which was an absolute shock. I didn't know that, including one of their wives. So that added an element to them that they went from being card-carrying members of the Communists in the middle of the Cold War, something that was quite risky, to being uber capitalist later on and earning $15 billion on an addictive drug and having totally abandoned their ideals of Marxism. And so that made it a more interesting story. So they become about a third of the book, but I never would have imagined that before actually going out and doing it.
One last question for you. In what order would you yourself read your books?
Oh, I'm such a bad judge of this because,
We'll start with pharma, of course.
Because here's what happens. The book that you're most excited about is the book you're currently working on or just finished. And it better be, because if not, you're in real trouble. You're enmeshed in all the details of it. My wife, Patricia, she's an author. She works with me. We are in the world of that book. Our friends, by halfway through the book project, are totally bored. They're rolling their eyes because that's what we talk about. So that's what we think is the best book. But I do think that in some ways, Case Closed is a book that many people go to because it tells you the story of the assassination that they know something about. But in terms of assassinations, Trish and I both like a great deal Killing the Dream, the book about the assassination of Martin Luther King. James Earl Ray was a more complex enigma than Lee Harvey Oswald. I know that's hard to imagine. A much more complicated figure and a person where at the end, I'm sure that Ray is the assassin, but you're left with these lingering doubts as he dies holding these secrets. The case doesn't get nearly the attention because King and Kennedy, everybody's fascinated by the Kennedy assassination, but the King assassination, we made bigger breakthroughs in terms of that work. And I will say that both God's Bankers, the history of finances at the Vatican, I was raised Catholic, but this is about the business side of the Vatican, not about the religion, and Pharma are these big sweeping investigative tales. You have to be in the mood for a deep dive, but in the process of doing it, what I love about those books is I will hear back from people in the drug industry or doctors or others who have been in the industry, or I'll hear back from church historians, and they'll say to me, I knew this part of the book. That was familiar with me, but I never knew this. That was fascinating. And that's the best, when somebody who lives their life in the field comes back to you and says, I learned something from that book that I never knew. And so, they are in the end what? Follow the money stories, both of them. Follow the money is always a good way to tell a good story.
That's great. Well, Gerald, thanks very much for being on the podcast.